The Queen's Necklace. The Scandal Marie Antoinette Never Ordered. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. The crime that didn't need a queen. Versailles was built to make people feel small. Even before you stepped into the Hall of Mirrors, you could sense it in the geometry of the gardens, the way nature itself had been disciplined into obedience, clipped and arranged into perfect lines. Everything here announced a single message: power is real, and it belongs to someone else. In the morning, the palace woke like a theater. Servants moved like shadows. Courtiers drifted in silk and perfume, smiling too brightly, watching too carefully. There were rules for how close you could stand to a royal body, and rules for who could speak first, and rules for who was allowed to be seen. The court ran on ritual, but it survived on something far more fragile. It survived on belief. Because Versailles wasn't only a palace. It was a machine designed to produce reality. If the right person said something was true, if the right people repeated it, then it became true, no matter what the evidence whispered in private. And in the summer of 1785, that machine was about to swallow itself. It began, as so many disasters do, with an object too expensive to exist. A necklace, more diamond than metal, more glitter than sense. 2 million livres worth of cut stones, assembled into a thing of such obscene splendor that even those used to luxury found it difficult to look at directly. It was not jewelry so much as a declaration. It said, "We can afford anything, even when the country could not." When the necklace appeared, it carried an assumption with it. A piece like this could only belong to one woman. Marie Antoinette. The Queen of France was already a legend by then, not the real woman, but the one invented by pamphleteers and enemies. She was said to be frivolous, foreign, vain, wasteful, a woman who spent while the nation starved. Whether or not those accusations were fair was beside the point. What mattered was that they were useful. Useful to political rivals. Useful to the public's anger. Useful to anyone who needed a villain in a story that was turning ugly. So when a scandal erupted around a diamond necklace, it didn't need proof to attach itself to her throat. It only needed the shape of her. That's the true crime at the heart of this tale, a fraud that did not require the Queen's participation, and yet used her name like a key. A scheme assembled by a woman with a noble title and empty pockets, handed to a man who wore the robes of a prince of the church, and powered by the oldest engine in the world, human longing. The affair of the diamond necklace is often described as a con. And it was. It involved forged letters, staged meetings, a counterfeit queen in the gardens of Versailles, and a cardinal willing to believe what he wanted more than what was sensible. It involved diamonds cut into brilliance and then broken up, sold off piece by piece like stolen starlight. But it was also something larger, a rehearsal. A demonstration of how easily the public could be persuaded to despise, how quickly truth could be drowned in sensation, how fragile authority became once laughter and suspicion entered the room. If you want to understand how a monarchy falls, you could begin with bread prices and debt. Or you could begin with a necklace. Because while diamonds do not bleed, reputations do. And in the years before the Revolution, France was already full of invisible wounds. The necklace simply made them glitter. Chapter 1. Versailles, a theater of power. The day began with a door. Not a grand one, not the kind that swung open to reveal chandeliers and gilded ceilings, but a smaller, more personal threshold, the entrance to a royal bedchamber. At Versailles, power could be measured by how close you were allowed to stand to a sleeping body. In a place where everything was performance, the most intimate moments became public rituals. Courtiers gathered early, careful not to appear eager, careful not to appear indifferent. The air smelled of powder and pomade, and beneath it all, a faint human odor, sweat hidden under perfume, nerves hidden under lace. Inside, the monarchy was not simply a family. It was an idea made flesh. Every movement, rising, dressing, eating, walking, was observed. It wasn't always cruelty. Often it was just habit. But habit has its own violence. The court taught people to reshape themselves until they fit into the hierarchy, smiling as they were pressed into place. To be seen at Versailles was to exist. To be ignored was to vanish. And everyone noticed what the Queen did. Marie Antoinette had become the most watched woman in France, which meant she had become the most interpreted. She was Austrian by birth and French by obligation, a fact her enemies never let her forget. Her laughter could be framed as arrogance. Her silence could be framed as disdain. If she attended a ball, she was frivolous. If she refused, she was cold. If she spent, she was greedy. If she didn't, she was lying. There was no winning a game whose rules were written by people who wanted you to lose. This was the environment in which scandal thrived. Versailles produced gossip the way a body produces heat, constantly, without effort. Information slid across rooms on fans and glances. It was carried by servants, repeated by courtiers, embroidered by rivals, and ultimately sold to the public in the form of pamphlets that made the royal family into characters in an obscene play. Rumor became a kind of entertainment, but it was also a tool. A whisper could shift alliances. A suggestion could ruin a household. A scandal could remove a rival without a duel or a decree. And beyond the palace walls, the public was hungry, not only for bread, but for explanations. France's finances were strained. The nation's debts were enormous. Many people lived close to desperation, and desperation creates a hunger for someone to blame. The Queen, with her foreign accent and her reputation for luxury, made an excellent symbol. She didn't need to be guilty. She only needed to be plausible. By the time the necklace entered this story, the Queen's name was already being used as shorthand for excess. Her image had been flattened into a caricature, a woman draped in jewels while children starved. Truth, in a culture like this, didn't disappear. It simply stopped mattering as much as the story. And in that climate, where appearances served as proof and hearsay served as law, all it took to start a catastrophe was a single glittering object and a single opportunist who understood the value of belief. Outside the palace, the gardens glittered with dew. Inside, voices softened and sharpened. Somewhere in Paris, a jeweler stared at a necklace he couldn't sell. And somewhere else, a woman with a noble name and an empty stomach began to plan. Versailles was not built to tell the truth. It was built to make the truth obey. Chapter 2. A necklace no one can sell. In the beginning, the necklace was a dream. Not a practical dream, nothing about this object was practical, but the kind of dream that appears when craftsmen believe they are building something immortal. The jewelers worked by candlelight, their fingers steady, their eyes watering from smoke and focus. Diamonds, once cut, have a particular cruelty. They catch every flicker of light and throw it back brighter. They refuse to be subtle. The necklace they assembled was not meant for an ordinary customer. It was a royal piece, a waterfall of stones arranged into loops and garlands, designed to sit against the skin like a constellation. It had weight, not only in metal and gems, but in implication. It said, France is rich enough to wear the stars. Behaviour and Bassenge had staked everything on it. They were not fools. They understood how the court worked. They understood desire. They understood that the right jewel on the right throat could become a political statement. They assumed, as many did, that the necklace would end up with the woman everyone watched. But Versailles was shifting. By the time the necklace was ready, the nation's mood had begun to sour. The monarchy's spending was under scrutiny. Marie Antoinette was already accused of extravagance. Even if she wanted the necklace, and there is evidence she did not, buying it would have been a provocation. The jewelers offered it anyway. They presented it with reverence, with certainty, with the faith of men who believed they had built something too magnificent to be refused. In their imaginations, the Queen would gasp, her eyes would widen, and she would reach for it as though it belonged to her by divine right. Instead, she declined. No matter how delicately the refusal was phrased, it was a refusal all the same. And for Behaviour and Bassenge, it was not simply disappointment. It was disaster. Because the necklace had been financed through credit. Jewelers of this level did not pay for diamonds in full upfront. They borrowed, promised, negotiated. Their suppliers waited. Their debts accrued interest. They were bound to this necklace like a man bound to an anchor. And now the anchor wouldn't sink, it wouldn't settle into the safe place of a royal purchase. It was trapped in limbo, too expensive for anyone but royalty, too politically dangerous for royalty to buy. An unsellable masterpiece. Their workshop became haunted by it. The necklace sat inside its case like a sleeping predator. Every time they opened it, it glittered with a kind of accusation. The longer it remained unsold, the more it threatened to ruin them. Their creditors would not be patient forever. And in the world of Parisian luxury, bankruptcy was not merely financial failure. It was social death. Desperation sharpened them into risk. A man who is desperate does not ask, "Is this true?" He asks, "Could this save me?" So when an opportunity appeared, when someone hinted at access, at favor, at secret royal desires, the jewelers were not prepared to be skeptical. Skepticism is a luxury. They needed salvation. And salvation at court often arrived wearing a beautiful lie. The necklace didn't need to be worn. It only needed to be believed in. And the jewelers believed in it like a religion. Chapter 3. Jeanne de la Motte, Poverty with a Noble Name. Jeanne de la Motte grew up close enough to luxury to know what it smelled like. The fragrance of waxed floors in fine homes. The crisp whiteness of linen. The sweet smoke of expensive candles. The way servants lowered their eyes. The way doors opened faster for the well-dressed. The way the world softened around people who did not need to ask permission to exist. She had a noble lineage, a claim that mattered in a country obsessed with bloodlines, but lineage without money is a cruel thing. It tastes like promise, and then it turns to ash. Jeanne learned early that nobility could be used like a costume. It could be displayed, hinted at, draped around the self. But it had to be performed. People believed what looked convincing, and Jeanne understood how to look convincing. She also understood resentment. It is one thing to be poor when you have never known any other life. It is another thing to be poor when you believe you are entitled to splendor. Jeanne's poverty was not humble. It was furious. She knew the court. Not as a figure who belonged there, but as a figure who circled it, watching, studying. She understood that Versailles was full of people who wanted something: approval, favor, influence, pleasure. People with money wanted novelty. People with status wanted excitement. People with power wanted devotion. And people who wanted something could be moved. She married Nicolas de la Motte, and together they became a kind of partnership, two ambitious people with charm and nerve, prepared to take what life refused to hand them. Nicolas was not the mastermind Jeanne was, but he was useful. He could travel. He could deliver messages. He could speak with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him a better share. Jeanne's gift was subtler. She could make people feel chosen. She could make them feel seen. She could tell them what they wanted to hear without seeming to flatter them. She could offer the illusion of access, a whisper of intimacy with the highest circles, and people would pay for that illusion in money, in favors, in their own reputations. There is a particular kind of crime that thrives in hierarchical societies, a crime built on desire for proximity. It doesn't require weapons. It doesn't require violence. It requires a gate, and someone who claims they hold the key. Jeanne, armed with a title and a fearless understanding of human weakness, began to position herself where she could be useful. She cultivated the image of a woman connected to court. She made herself an intermediary, not of money, not of jewels, but of people. And people are always more valuable than diamonds. By the time the necklace entered her orbit, Jeanne's life had trained her for exactly this moment. She had seen how Versailles worshipped appearances. She had seen how the public hated the Queen's supposed extravagance. She had seen how men with power still craved validation like children. All she needed now was the right target. And the right object. Jeanne didn't set out to steal diamonds. She set out to steal a destiny. And Versailles was full of people ready to hand it to her. Chapter 4. Cardinal de Rohan, the man who needed the Queen. Louis René Edouard de Rohan did not look like a villain. Villains, in the popular imagination, are obvious: sharp features, cold eyes, a mouth that curls into cruelty. Rohan was something more dangerous, because he was something more common, a man who believed he deserved admiration. He had wealth. He had rank. He had power. He moved through the world with the assumption of entitlement, a man accustomed to doors opening and people stepping aside. As a cardinal, he held religious authority. As a prince of the church, he carried a grandeur that blurred the lines between spiritual influence and political reach. And yet, he was restless. Because there was one door that did not open for him. Marie Antoinette did not like him. The reasons were both personal and political, tangled in the web of court factions and foreign alliances. The details mattered less than the outcome. He was frozen out. The Queen's refusal to accept him wasn't just a social slight. In Versailles, social exclusion could become political death. Rohan wanted back in. Not simply for advantage, though advantage was part of it, but for something more intimate. He wanted the queen's approval the way some men want a mother's love, desperately, irrationally, painfully. This made him vulnerable. At court, everyone has a weakness. Some people crave money. Some people crave sex. Some people crave revenge. Rohan's weakness was more refined, and therefore easier to disguise. He craved absolution, and that craving made him easy to manipulate. If someone could convince him the queen was softening, if someone could present themselves as the bridge back to favour, he would cross that bridge without checking if it held. Jeanne de la Motte understood this almost immediately. She approached him carefully, like a hunter approaching a startled animal. She did not demand. She suggested. She hinted. She created a world in which she was useful, a woman who had access to secrets, who had private knowledge, who could whisper the queen's moods and preferences into his ear. At first, Rohan resisted. Not because he was wise, but because he was cautious. He knew there were enemies at court. He knew reputations could be manufactured. He had lived long enough to recognize that power attracted impostors. But the thing about a longing is that it does not sit quietly. It presses. It nags. It shapes the mind. And Rohan's longing to return to favour had grown into something so large it was beginning to block out reason. Jeanne did not have to force him. She only had to offer him hope. Soon, he began to give her small gifts. Small favours. Small opportunities. In his mind, these were investments, not in a woman, but in a future where he could walk into the queen's presence and be forgiven. He did not yet realize that the future he was investing in did not exist. He thought he was negotiating with Versailles. He was negotiating with his own desire. And desire always overpays. Chapter 5. I can reach her. The first rule of a successful con is simple: do not begin with the lie. Begin with the truth. Jeanne de la Motte understood that people were not convinced by what was possible. They were convinced by what was familiar. So she built her deception the way Versailles built its power, slowly, through ritual and implication. She began by speaking as though she already belonged. Not loudly. Not crudely. She wasn't a charlatan waving her arms in a tavern. She moved through the world with the calm confidence of someone who had been invited. She dropped names like they were nothing. She hinted at encounters without describing them. She spoke of the queen as though she were an acquaintance, a woman who had confided in her, who had recognized her noble blood and felt sympathy. It was a ridiculous claim. Which was exactly why it worked. Because people don't expect ridiculous lies from people who look composed. They expect them from the frantic, the desperate, the obviously scheming. Jeanne's greatest weapon was her ability to appear reasonable. Rohan listened. He wanted to believe her, and wanting is a kind of gravity. It pulls you towards the thing you desire, even if the ground beneath it is thin. Jeanne gave him something small, a suggestion that the queen had mentioned him. That she had been less harsh lately. That she regretted misunderstandings. That perhaps she might be ready to forgive him if approached correctly. Rohan tried not to show how much this mattered. But he couldn't help himself. His attention sharpened. He asked careful questions. He offered gentle invitations. He began to treat Jeanne as a person of importance, because she offered him the one thing he could not easily obtain at court, the illusion of a private pathway. Jeanne, watching him, adjusted her story the way a seamstress adjusts fabric. She stitched the lie to fit his hope. Soon there were letters, or rather, the promise of letters. Jeanne suggested the queen might be willing to write discreetly, away from official channels. Rohan's pulse, if he had been honest with himself, would have betrayed him. He was a cardinal, a man of the church, and yet he was responding like a boy in love. And perhaps in a sense he was. Not with the queen as a person, but with the queen as an idea, the radiant center of Versailles, the source of redemption, the woman who could restore his status with a word. Jeanne's scheme began to grow beyond conversation. She recruited assistants. She relied on the fact that in Paris, as in any city, there are always people willing to do odd jobs for money. A message delivered. A document copied. A meeting arranged. A woman paid to wear the right dress. Each small act was harmless on its own. Together, they began to form a machine. And the most dangerous part of the machine wasn't Jeanne's cunning. It was Rohan's cooperation. Because a con doesn't truly succeed until the victim begins to participate in the lie. until he invests in it, until he defends it, until he reshapes his own reality to make the deception feel inevitable. By the time Jean said softly, confidently, "I can reach her," Rohan didn't doubt her. He needed her. And Jean, sensing the shift, understood something vital. She now held a man of immense power on a thread. All she had to do was pull. Once a man believes the Queen is speaking to him in secret, there is almost nothing he won't do to keep that secret alive. Chapter 6. Letters in a Queen's Hand. The ink came first. Not the diamonds, not the contracts, not the garden theatre at Versailles. Just ink, laid carefully onto paper in a hand that was not the Queen's, but was close enough to pass in the half-light of hope. Forged letters are rarely about handwriting alone. They're about tone, about mood, about creating the sensation that someone is speaking directly to you, privately, intimately, in a world where intimacy is controlled like currency. Jean de la Motte knew this. She knew that if Cardinal de Rohan was ever to do what she needed, he had to feel more than convinced. He had to feel chosen. So she arranged for letters to appear. They were delivered not as official correspondence, which would have been impossible, but as secret messages, slipped into the gaps of court life where servants carried trays and whispers slipped between curtains. Jean made herself the conduit, the bridge, the living proof that there was a private channel between Rohan and the Queen. Rohan was a man trained in ceremony. He knew that a royal message could change a life. And when the first letter arrived, bearing the intoxicating suggestion of Marie Antoinette's voice, it struck him with the weight of a sacrament. He read it in private. In his chambers, away from mocking eyes and political enemies, he unfolded the paper as though it might burn him. He studied the loops and strokes, the deliberate lines meant to mimic a queenly hand. He searched for the thing that would prove it false. He did not find it. Instead, he found what his heart had been begging for: warmth, forgiveness, a suggestion that the Queen regretted misunderstandings, a hint that she recognized his devotion, a tone that made him feel as though he had been misjudged, and was now being offered a second chance. A man with power can be flattered into many things, but a man who believes he is being restored to favor becomes something far more dangerous. He becomes obedient. Jean did not rush. The letters came in intervals, as though the Queen was cautious, constrained by court politics, forced into secrecy by the harsh light of Versailles. Each letter deepened the illusion of intimacy. Each letter made Rohan feel more special and more at risk, because secrecy is thrilling, but it is also a leash. Rohan began to reply. At first he wrote carefully, the way a man writes to a monarch, respectful, restrained, dutiful. But the longer the correspondence continued, the more the boundaries softened. The voice in the forged letters drew him closer. It suggested reliance, trust, vulnerability. It implied that the Queen was surrounded by enemies, isolated within her own palace, and that she needed allies who were loyal to her, not merely to the throne. It was an absurd fantasy, but it was also emotionally precise. Versailles was a place where everyone felt watched, where everyone suspected betrayal, where even the Queen was rumored to be trapped in political games she could not fully control. Jean used that plausibility, that grain of truth, and built her lie on top of it, brick by brick. If Rohan had been a different man, less vain, less hopeful, less hungry, he might have noticed something. The letters were too convenient, too eager, too generous. Queens did not write like this. Queens did not need to. But Rohan did not ask why a queen would risk everything for him. He asked what he could do to prove he deserved it. Jean, receiving his replies, smiled to herself. She understood the conversion taking place inside him. She understood that he was no longer merely being deceived. He was participating. And once a victim begins to participate, the con no longer needs force. It moves on devotion alone. The letters didn't simply convince him. They changed him. And a changed man will defend a lie even against the evidence of his own eyes. Chapter 7. The Garden Encounter. Words can be forged. But a meeting, even a brief one, has a different kind of power. It becomes a memory. A scene replayed in the mind with obsessive clarity. It becomes a private proof, anchored in sensation. Jean knew that sooner or later, Rohan's doubts would return. Not enough to stop him, perhaps, but enough to make him cautious. She could not allow caution. So she gave him an experience. The gardens of Versailles by day were disciplined splendor, symmetrical hedges, gravel paths, fountains, and statues positioned like frozen witnesses. By night, they became something else entirely. Without sunlight, the perfection softened into shadow. The clipped hedges became mazes. The marble became pale and ghost-like. The scent of flowers thickened into something almost narcotic. Jean chose night on purpose. Night is the ally of illusion. The plan required a woman willing to play a queen. Nicole de Oliva was not noble. She was not even, by Versailles standards, respectable. She was a prostitute, accustomed to performing whatever a paying man needed. She understood how to become an image. She understood how to hold a pose, how to say a line, how to make a man feel he was receiving something rare. Jean dressed her with care, a gown, a veil, perhaps a pale cloak that would catch the moonlight. The details mattered less than the overall effect. Rohan did not need a perfect likeness. He needed a shape he could worship. When he arrived, he was trembling. A cardinal trembling in the gardens, waiting like a lover. Waiting like a man whose entire future rested on a single encounter. The night air was cool, but sweat pricked at his skin. Every sound, a footstep, a rustle of leaves, seemed like it might be an enemy approaching. And then she appeared. The queen stepped into view with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to being watched. The veil hid her face, which made her more convincing, not less. A real queen was rarely seen plainly by anyone outside her inner circle. A veil suggested privacy, and privacy suggested intimacy, and intimacy made the lie irresistible. Rohan approached as though he were walking towards an altar. Nicole said only a few words. It did not take more. A soft voice. A short statement of forgiveness. A suggestion that he had been misunderstood. Perhaps she offered him a rose, or allowed him to kiss her hand. It was not the exact details that mattered. It was the gesture. A gesture, for someone like Rohan, could outweigh logic. Because a gesture is a gift. A confirmation. A sign from the heavens. And in that moment, beneath the trees, surrounded by shadows and clipped hedges, Rohan felt as though he had been granted a miracle. He left the garden with his doubts dissolved. He left believing the queen had met him secretly. Believing she had forgiven him. Believing he now had a private connection to the most powerful woman in France. Jean had not merely convinced him. She had sealed him. Because once a man believes he has been singled out by royalty, he becomes dangerously invested in that belief. He cannot afford to question it. Questioning it would mean admitting his own stupidity, his own vanity, his own weakness. And vanity, once threatened, will defend itself with ferocity. Jean watched the aftermath with satisfaction. She understood that Rohan's mind would protect the memory like a holy relic. He would polish it. He would replay it. He would adjust it until it became perfect. From now on, when she spoke to him of the queen's secret wishes, he would not ask for evidence. He would remember the garden, and he would obey. After that night, it no longer mattered what was true. It mattered only what Rohan could not bear to doubt. Chapter 8. The Secret Purchase. The necklace still sat in its case, glittering in the jeweler's workshop like a trapped storm. Baimer and Bassenge had begun to look tired. Their faces carried the strain of men who had invested in magnificence and been punished for it. Creditors hovered. Suppliers grew impatient. Every day the necklace remained unsold. Their salvation became more urgent and more unlikely. Then an opportunity arrived wearing a title. Jean de la Motte approached them not as a beggar, but as a woman of influence. She spoke as though she had already crossed the palace thresholds they could only imagine. She hinted that she knew the queen's tastes. That she understood what the queen wanted. That she was aware of quiet desires that could not be spoken openly. And she told them exactly what they needed to hear. Marie Antoinette, Jean suggested, had changed her mind. The queen wanted the necklace. But she wanted it discreetly. In a time of financial strain and public resentment, buying such a piece openly would be political suicide. Yet the queen, Jean implied, still desired beauty. Still desired splendor. Still wished to own what only she could own. So she would purchase it in secret. The jewelers heard the words and felt the world tilt back towards possibility. Secret purchase explained everything. The earlier refusal, the current silence, the delay. It made sense of the impossible. And when Jean introduced them to Cardinal de Rohan as the intermediary, as the man who would manage the transaction on the Queen's behalf, the deal became not merely plausible, but seductive. Rohan arrived with confidence and solemnity. He was a prince of the church, his presence alone carried weight. The jewelers believed that a cardinal would not stake his reputation on nonsense. They did not understand that even cardinals can be foolish when their pride is involved. Rohan, intoxicated by the idea of serving the queen secretly, agreed to negotiate. He played the role Jean needed him to play, respectful, official, persuasive. He assured the jewelers he was acting under royal instruction. He spoke of installment payments, of contracts, of discretion. He made the con look like a bureaucratic inconvenience rather than a criminal plot. Paper appeared. Terms were set. And somewhere in those contracts, the queen's name was written, either directly or by implication, like a spell. It is difficult to overstate how much power a royal name carried. The queen's name meant safety. It meant eventual payment. It meant a purchase backed by the crown itself. And yet, in the hands of a con artist, a name could become a weapon. Jean watched the negotiations with the calm satisfaction of someone who has done this many times, though on a smaller scale. She understood that desperation makes people careless. She understood that Rohan's ego made him eager. She understood that the jeweler's fear made them ready to trust. All the pieces were now in motion. The necklace was about to move. In Versailles, secrecy was normal. That's why the lie didn't sound like a lie. It sounded like business. Chapter 9. The Handover. The necklace left the workshop the way a body leaves a home, with reverence, with anxiety, with a strange sense of inevitability. The jewelers placed it into its case, closed the lid, and for a moment it seemed almost peaceful, a treasure made manageable. But the calm was deceptive. Inside the case were diamonds that could ruin men, and now they were being handed into someone else's custody. Cardinal de Rohan collected the necklace personally. He did not trust it to a servant. He did not trust it to a messenger. This was, in his mind, a royal secret and a sacred duty. He carried it with care, aware of its weight and its value, aware of how easily the court could turn on him if anything went wrong. Jean had instructed him precisely. There would be a handover. A discreet transfer to a trusted royal agent. All he needed to do was follow the plan. And Rohan, having been trained by the letters and the garden encounter, did not question her. He brought the necklace to Jean's residence, not a palace, not even a grand home by aristocratic standards, but a place that had been made convincing through decoration and confidence. A place that implied status even if the walls could not truly hold it. Jean received him with controlled composure. There were no trembling hands, no frantic eyes, no signs of desperation. She behaved like a woman accustomed to handling royal matters. The case was placed on a table. When Jean opened it, the diamonds caught the light. The room filled with cold brilliance. For a moment, even the con artists themselves might have felt the hush of awe. Then, as rehearsed, a messenger arrived, someone presented as a royal courier. A valet. A representative. The man's identity mattered less than his costume and his confidence. Rohan watched the exchange, feeling the strange thrill of secrecy. He believed he was witnessing royal intimacy, the queen's secret purchase, the discreet retrieval, the quiet flow of luxury behind the scenes. He did not notice that there was no proof this messenger had any connection to the palace. He did not notice because he did not want to. The messenger took the case and left. And the most important thing that happened in that moment was not the theft itself. It was that Rohan, standing there in that modest room, accepted that the queen had taken possession of the necklace, without ever seeing her. Jean had built her lie so well that Rohan filled in the missing steps himself. His imagination, fueled by longing, completed the story with absolute certainty. Once the case disappeared through the door, the diamonds were no longer jewelry. They were loot. They were evidence. They were the center of a scandal that had not yet been born. Rohan walked away believing he had served the queen. Jean walked away knowing she had stolen a fortune. And somewhere in Versailles, Marie Antoinette continued her life unaware that her name had just been used to commit a crime. The queen never saw the necklace. But the necklace had already begun to tighten around her throat. Chapter 10. Breaking the Stars. If the necklace had remained whole, it might have been traced. As long as it existed in its original form, it was a singular object, recognizable, infamous, impossible to hide. A masterpiece has a fingerprint. Anyone in the trade could identify it. Jean and her associates understood this. So they did the most brutal thing you can do to a beautiful object. They destroyed it. The necklace was dismantled piece by piece, the settings pried open, the stones freed. Diamonds that had been arranged to mimic garlands and constellations were reduced to individual commodities, anonymous units of brilliance. There is a quiet horror in watching something made for one throat become hundreds of separate transactions. It is not only theft. It is erasure. The object loses its identity, and with it, its history. But Jean was not sentimental. Sentimentality does not pay debts or buy silk. Sentimentality does not satisfy hunger for status. She had risked everything for this moment, and she intended to reap the reward. The diamonds began to move. Paris first, discreet sales, trusted contacts, careful negotiations. Then beyond, London markets where French scandal could be turned into English profit. Middlemen were involved. Fences. Merchants who did not ask too many questions. Men who understood that luxury goods often come with dirt attached and that dirt can be ignored if the price is right. Money flowed back to Jean. And with money came transformation. She began to live differently. Better clothes. Better lodgings. A brighter confidence. She moved through Paris like a woman who had finally forced the world to recognize her worth. This was her mistake. When con artists are successful, they often believe they have become invincible. They forget that sudden wealth attracts attention. They forget that the very society they are trying to impress is trained to sniff out irregularity. Jean's new life had edges that did not match her story. People noticed. Servants noticed. Neighbors noticed. Merchants noticed. Paris, like Versailles, was a place where information traveled quickly, and where envy sharpened curiosity. Meanwhile, the jewelers waited. They expected installment payments. They expected correspondence. They expected the slow, safe rhythm of royal purchase, because that was what they had been promised, and because that was what they desperately needed. But the money did not arrive. At first, they made excuses. Royal matters are complicated. Royal payments are delayed. One does not pester a queen. Then the fear deepened into something more violent. Because a necklace worth 2 million livres was not the kind of debt you could ignore. And the longer the jewelers waited, the more their salvation began to look like a trap. Jean sold diamond after diamond, buying herself time. But time is not forgiveness. Time is merely the distance between the crime and the moment it is discovered. And discovery, like debt, always comes due. Jean thought she was selling diamonds. She was selling time, and time eventually runs out. Chapter 11. Payment Day. For a time, the jewelers had been able to pretend. They told themselves that royal purchases moved slowly. That queens were not bound to the same rhythms as ordinary debtors. That money, when it arrived from the crown, arrived like weather, delayed, unpredictable, but inevitable. It was a comforting fantasy. And like most comforting fantasies, it did not survive contact with arithmetic. Bemer and Bassenge had creditors. They had suppliers who had waited long enough. Their business depended on reputation, and in Paris, reputation was more fragile than glass. Every day without payment was another crack. Every unanswered letter was another rumor. They sent careful reminders. Polite phrases. Formal language. The kind of writing a tradesman uses when addressing the powerful, deferential, restrained, wrapped in the soft cloth of respect. Still, the payments did not come. At first, they blamed bureaucracy. Then they blamed miscommunication. Then, in the quiet hours when the workshop was dim and the necklace's empty case sat like a coffin, they began to suspect something darker. A royal purchase was supposed to be safe. That was its entire appeal. When the crown bought, money came, eventually, and the maker gained not only profit but prestige. The jewelers had clung to this belief because it was their only buoy in deep water. Now the buoy was sinking. The moment came when they could no longer wait. Desperation has a way of making ordinary men brave. Or foolish. They decided to go directly to Marie Antoinette. It was an act of sheer necessity. A leap across social boundaries. Jewelers, even celebrated ones, did not walk into a queen's orbit with demands. You did not trouble Her Majesty with complaints. You did not suggest she might have failed to pay. But their entire future was hanging by a thread of diamond dust. There was no elegant way to drown. So they took the risk. Imagine the Queen's expression when they spoke. Marie Antoinette had spent years being accused of extravagance. She had already learned that whatever she did could be turned into ammunition. The last thing she needed was a necklace scandal. And yet here were two men standing in front of her, respectful, frightened, insistent, speaking as though she had ordered an object she had never seen. At first she might have assumed it was a misunderstanding. Then she would have felt the edge of alarm. Then very quickly, the alarm sharpened into fury. Because the implication was not merely that she had purchased a necklace. It was that she had done so in secret. A secret purchase of obscene luxury. A purchase that suggested deceit, vanity, extravagance. Exactly the kind of story France already wanted to believe about her. The Queen denied it. She denied it with the clarity of truth, but also with the urgency of self-defense. She denied it because it was false, yes, but also because she understood what a story like this could do to her. The jewelers left not comforted, but terrified. And Marie Antoinette, once the door had closed behind them, would have realized something chilling. Her name had been used. Her authority had been impersonated. Someone had taken her signature and turned it into currency. A necklace was missing. A fortune had vanished. And now, inevitably, there would be questions. The lie had shifted. Until now it had been a private deception, contained within a small circle of greed and longing. Now it was a royal matter. And royal matters do not stay quiet for long. The moment the Queen said, "I know nothing of this," the con stopped being a theft. And became a threat to the crown. Chapter 12. The royal choice. Make it public. There were ways this could have been handled. Quiet investigations. Discreet interrogations. A private arrest. A scandal contained behind the palace walls like a shameful illness. The monarchy had done this before. Versailles was skilled at turning mess into silence. But the affair of the diamond necklace was not simply a theft. It was an insult. Someone had impersonated the Queen. Someone had used her name to steal an object so expensive it could become a national symbol of corruption. And Marie Antoinette, already the target of public suspicion, could not afford even a hint that she had been involved. The court debated. Advisors murmured. Officials weighed the political risks. Some would have argued for discretion, for avoiding the kind of public spectacle that could grow into popular entertainment. But Marie Antoinette wanted vindication. Not quietly, not privately. Publicly. She wanted the world to see that she was not responsible. She wanted the guilty punished in a way that would make an example. She wanted a display of royal authority that would force belief. This was the fatal misunderstanding. Because belief cannot be forced. Not when a nation is already suspicious. Not when pamphlets have trained the public to imagine the worst. Not when the monarchy's image is already bruised. Still, the decision was made. The authorities identified Cardinal de Rohan as central to the scandal, the man who had brokered the purchase, the man who had carried the necklace, the man whose name could not be ignored. And they chose to arrest him in the one place where the arrest would echo loudest. Versailles itself. The plan was simple. A dramatic public humiliation of a powerful man would prove that the crown was strong, decisive, and in control. It would show that even a cardinal could be punished if he offended the Queen. It would restore authority through theatre. But theatre cuts both ways. A public arrest at Versailles would not only punish Rohan. It would announce to the entire court, and soon to the entire country, that something terrible had happened. And people, once they smell scandal, follow it like hounds. The monarchy's attempt to crush the story would instead give it oxygen. Marie Antoinette, in demanding public justice, was trying to save her reputation. But reputations do not survive spectacle intact. Especially not when the spectacle itself suggests fear. They believed a public arrest would end the scandal. In truth, it was the moment the scandal became unstoppable. Chapter 13. Arrest at Versailles. Versailles woke as it always did. Soft footsteps, rustling silk, servants carrying trays, courtiers gliding towards their positions like actors finding their marks. But that morning, something in the air was wrong. It was not yet visible, not yet spoken aloud. It was a pressure, a subtle tightening, the sense that a storm was gathering inside the palace walls. Cardinal de Rohan arrived believing his life was about to improve. He had been led to think, through Jean's manufactured intimacy, that the Queen's hostility was softening. Perhaps there would be a message. Perhaps there would be forgiveness. Perhaps today would be the day he stepped back into favour. It is possible, even likely, that he dressed with care, that he chose his finest robes, that he rehearsed the expression he would wear in front of the Queen, humble, devoted, relieved. He was summoned. He entered the palace expecting a doorway into redemption. Instead, he walked into ruin. The arrest was carried out with precision, the kind of precision that can only exist in a place addicted to ceremony. Officials approached. Words were spoken formally. Hands were placed where they had no right to be placed. The cardinal, a man used to commanding rooms, found himself commanded. The shock would have been physical. For a moment, he may not have understood. The mind, when confronted with sudden catastrophe, often refuses to accept it. He might have thought it was a misunderstanding, a mistake, a test. Then the realization hit. He was being arrested in public. Not quietly escorted away, but seized, in full view of the court. Courtiers watched with wide eyes behind fans. Whispers spread instantly, like fire in dry straw. The arrest was not merely legal, it was symbolic. It was the monarchy demonstrating power over a man of immense status. And yet, to those watching, it could also look like panic. Because why arrest a cardinal so publicly unless the scandal was enormous? Unless the crown was terrified? Unless something had gone wrong that could not be hidden? This is how spectacle betrays its own intention. The monarchy wanted the arrest to communicate strength. But to many, it communicated that the palace was vulnerable to fraud, that the Queen's name could be stolen, that even Versailles could be fooled. Rohan, stunned and humiliated, was taken away. And as he left, he may have clung to one final absurd hope, that the Queen would intervene, that she would save him, that she would reveal this as some kind of misunderstanding. Because a man who has built his identity around a lie will grasp at the lie until his hands bleed. Rohan had entered Versailles hoping to be forgiven. He left it as the most famous fool in France. Chapter 14. The Bastille Ensemble. Once Rohan fell, the rest followed. That is how scandal works. It begins as a crack and becomes a collapse. Everyone connected to the story is pulled into the light, whether they deserve it or not. Innocence is rarely tidy in a spectacle. Jeanne de la Motte was arrested. She had likely believed herself clever enough to outrun the consequences. She had dismantled the necklace, scattered the diamonds, converted them into money. She had taken the object apart so thoroughly it could never be reassembled. But stories cannot be dismantled in the same way. When authorities traced the threads, when they questioned the jewelers, interrogated Rohan, examined letters, Jeanne's name surfaced like a dark stain. She was taken into custody and brought to the Bastille. The Bastille was not simply a prison. It was a symbol, a looming stone promise of what happened when the state decided you were inconvenient. For aristocrats, it was shameful. For common people, it was terrifying. For anyone, it was a place where the future narrowed into a corridor with no doors. Nicole d'Oliva was also taken. She would have been confused, frightened, outraged. She had been hired to play a role for money. She had not understood she was standing inside a royal crime. She was an actress in a scene she did not write, and now she was being punished as though she were the author. Rétaux de Villette, the forger, was drawn into questioning. Ink became evidence. Handwriting became a weapon. The letters that had made Rohan feel chosen were now being held up in courtrooms and offices as proof of deception. And then there was Cagliostro. In another story, he would have been a sideshow, an occult celebrity, a self-styled magician who moved through elite circles selling mystery and charisma. But scandals are hungry things, and they devour extra characters when they can. Cagliostro's presence added an intoxicating Gothic flavor, whispers of secrets, rituals, manipulation beyond reason. The affair became not merely a crime, but a drama. Paris buzzed with it. The streets hummed. Salons filled with speculation. Pamphlets multiplied. It was entertainment, and it was politics, and it was a weapon used against the Queen whether she deserved it or not. Everyone wanted to know. Had Marie Antoinette really ordered the necklace? If she hadn't, how could such a fraud occur? If she was innocent, why did it feel so plausible that she would be guilty? A scandal like this is never content with factual answers. It wants meaning. It wants villains. It wants blood. And the Bastille, full of frightened people and whispered accusations, became the staging area for what France would soon treat as a national trial. The diamonds were gone. But the story had finally found the one thing more valuable than jewels: an audience. Chapter 15. Trial as Entertainment. By the time the proceedings began, France had already chosen its favorite version of the story. That is the dirty secret of sensational justice. The courtroom often arrives too late. Once a scandal becomes public entertainment, evidence struggles to compete with imagination. The Parliament of Paris prepared for a trial that would be watched like a spectacle. This was not only a legal event. It was a political contest, a battle over the meaning of the monarchy itself. Crowds gathered. Pamphlets flew through the streets. Caricatures turned real people into exaggerated monsters. Salons hosted debates as though they were discussing theatre. The affair had everything the public craved. It had wealth. It had sex, or the hint of sex. It had deceit and secret meetings. It had a queen whose reputation was already stained. And it had a cardinal, powerful, pompous, now humiliated, who made a delicious target for ridicule. Inside the courtroom, the players took their roles. Lawyers performed. Witnesses trembled. Officials tried to control the narrative. And in the background, like a shadow pressed against the wall, the Queen's name kept returning. Even when Marie Antoinette was not physically present, she was everywhere. The trial, formally, was about fraud. But socially, it was about whether the monarchy could still command belief. Rohan's defense leaned on his claim of sincerity. He had been deceived, he argued, because he believed he was serving the Queen. This defense was humiliating, but it was also strategic. It framed him as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Jean's story shifted depending on what she needed in the moment. She was clever, dramatic, sometimes defiant. She understood she was being watched not only by judges, but by history. She performed survival. Nicole de Oliva, dragged into a drama she barely understood, played innocence, and perhaps it was the purest innocence in the entire scandal, a woman paid to be a ghost. The court deliberated. And outside, the public fed on every detail. In France, where trust in authority was already collapsing, the affair of the diamond necklace became more than a trial. It became a symbol. A symbol that the palace could be fooled. A symbol that the Queen's virtue was questionable. A symbol that power was not as solid as it pretended to be. The law could declare guilt or innocence. But the public was deciding something else. It was deciding whether it still wanted to believe. The trial would end with verdicts. But for Marie Antoinette, the verdict had already been delivered in the streets. Chapter 16. The verdicts. There is a particular silence that falls in a courtroom before judgment. Not the respectful silence of prayer, but the tense, suspended hush of an audience waiting for a final line. People shift in their seats. Breaths become shallow. Even those who pretend indifference are listening as though their lives depend on it. The affair of the diamond necklace had become more than a case. It had become a mirror held up to France, reflecting vanity, hunger, and the collapse of trust. By the time the Parliament of Paris prepared to announce verdicts, the country was already full of opinions. The law could decide guilt. But the public had decided meaning. Rohan's verdict landed like a shock. He was not condemned as the mastermind. He was treated largely as a fool, a man who had been manipulated, misled, dragged into disgrace by his own vanity and desperation. In some versions of the story, the court's treatment of him was generous, even protective. The honor of a great name was spared from complete destruction. To the Queen, this was an outrage. Because a lenient treatment of Rohan could be interpreted as a criticism of her, as though the court was saying, yes, it was plausible you would do this, or it was understandable he believed it. It turned her denial into something that could be doubted. Jean's verdict was harsher. She was convicted. She was named the architect of the fraud, the dangerous woman at the center of the web. The court recognized what everyone else recognized, that she had used a royal name like a stolen seal. Nicole de Oliva, meanwhile, was generally treated as a pawn, a woman hired to play a role and dragged into catastrophe. She was a reminder that not everyone in a scandal is an architect, some are simply bodies moved into place. The Queen was officially declared innocent. That should have ended the matter. But innocence in court does not cleanse a reputation in public. What the monarchy had wanted was vindication, a clear, decisive moral outcome that would force belief. Instead, the verdicts produced something far messier. They produced uncertainty. They produced argument. They produced a story that could still be interpreted in whatever way a reader wanted it to be. And if a nation wants to distrust you, uncertainty is enough. Marie Antoinette, watching all of this, would have felt the terrible truth of it. She could be innocent and still be destroyed. The trial had proven a con occurred. It had proven her name was used. It had even punished the criminals. But the trial had also proved something else. It had proved that the Queen's reputation was no longer under her control. The court delivered verdicts. The streets delivered something far worse. Laughter, suspicion, and the slow certainty that the Queen's innocence didn't matter. Chapter 17. Branded. Punishment in 18th century France was not meant to be private. It was meant to be seen. Justice, in the eyes of the state, required an audience. A criminal's suffering was meant to reassure the public that order still existed. It was meant to teach. It was meant to frighten. It was also meant to satisfy. Jeanne de la Motte was brought out into that theatre. There is something obscene about public punishment, not only because of the violence, but because of the appetite it awakens in those watching. Crowds gather not merely out of moral concern, but out of fascination. People want to see what the law does to a body. Jeanne was humiliated. The details of her punishment are remembered because they were dramatic, because the state made sure they were. She was not simply imprisoned. She was marked. In some accounts, she was branded, a physical symbol pressed into her flesh as proof of guilt. It was meant to end her story. Instead, it turned her into a legend. Because once you mark someone publicly, you give them a narrative. You make them unforgettable. You announce that they matter enough to be destroyed in front of everyone. Jeanne endured the spectacle with a defiance that made her dangerous even in defeat. Perhaps she screamed. Perhaps she fought. Perhaps she fainted. Whatever her outward response, she did not become small. That, too, was part of her power. She was then returned to imprisonment, and here the tone of the story shifts. The public punishment is bright, loud, crowded. The prison is silent, cold, and private. The Bastille was stone and shadow. It swallowed people whole. Yet Jeanne remained Jeanne. Even trapped, even wounded, even condemned, she continued to think like someone who understood the true currency of Versailles, narrative. She knew she would not survive this with honor. She knew she would not be forgiven. So she prepared a different kind of weapon. If she could not win in court, she would win in story. If she could not reclaim diamonds, she would reclaim meaning. They branded her to end the scandal. All they did was create a villain the public could adore. Chapter 18. Escape and London. Escape stories always contain a kind of magic. They suggest that fate can be cheated, that walls can be outwitted, that the state is not as absolute as it claims. That alone is enough to make them dangerous. Jeanne escaped. The details of how she did it vary in retellings, but the core fact remains. She slipped out of the punishment designed to contain her and fled to England, to London, a city where French scandal could be turned into profit, and where enemies of the French crown were always willing to listen. London was grey, noisy, wet. The air smelled different. The streets were broader and harsher. For Jeanne, it was both exile and opportunity. She was no longer a woman moving through Paris with the illusion of connection to Versailles. Now she was a notorious figure. A criminal. A celebrity. A woman whose name appeared in rumors and papers. A living piece of the scandal. And she understood exactly how to use that. Jeanne began to write. She crafted her version of events with the instinct of someone who knew the public wanted blood and glamour. She painted herself as wronged. She implied deeper corruption. She fed the story France already wanted. She pointed her finger, again and again, towards Marie Antoinette. It is hard to say what Jeanne believed. Did she see herself as an avenger, exposing court rot? Did she see herself as a victim of a system that denied her dignity? Or did she simply know that selling a story was her last path to power? Perhaps all three can be true. In her telling, the Queen was not the innocent victim of fraud. She was the shadow behind it. It didn't matter whether that was factual. It mattered that it was believable. And belief, once it enters a culture already poisoned by resentment, spreads like disease. Jeanne's memoirs and claims did not create anti-Queen sentiment from nothing. They poured fuel on a fire already burning. She had escaped punishment, yes. But more importantly, she had escaped in a way that allowed her to continue doing what she did best, controlling narrative. If Versailles had been a theatre, London became her publishing house. And Marie Antoinette, miles away, could do almost nothing to stop the words from landing. In London, Jean could no longer steal diamonds. So she stole something far more valuable. The Queen's Story. Chapter 19. The Queen on Trial. Marie Antoinette was not in the dock. But she was the accused. That is the cruelty of political scandal. It chooses its target and then forces that target to defend against ghosts. The Queen had been officially cleared. The court had recognized she had not ordered the necklace. It had punished Jean. It had exposed forgery. In a rational world, that would have been the end. But France was not living in a rational world. France was living in a world where trust in the monarchy was dying. When trust dies, evidence becomes less important than feeling. People begin to interpret everything through suspicion. They stop asking, is it true? And begin asking, does it fit what I already believe? And the necklace affair fit perfectly. It fit the image of the Queen as extravagant. It fit the image of the court as corrupt. It fit the suspicion that those at the top lived by different rules. The scandal also produced a specific humiliation that the Queen could not erase, that her name had been used so convincingly, that it had been plausible, that people could imagine her ordering a 2 million livre necklace in secret. Even her innocence became part of the insult, because her innocence required the public to believe she was capable of restraint and modesty, qualities the public had been taught to doubt. Pamphlets spread. Conversations hardened into certainty. Every rumor became another layer of grime. The Queen's reputation, already fragile, began to decay. There is a tragedy in this that often gets overlooked. Marie Antoinette was a real person, with private fears and private griefs. She was also a symbol. She had been turned into a vessel for national frustration. And symbols are not treated gently. By the late 1780s, France was moving towards rupture, political crisis, economic strain, growing anger. The necklace affair did not cause the revolution by itself. History is never that neat, but it contributed to the collapse of legitimacy. It was a story people used to prove to themselves that the monarchy was unworthy. And once a nation decides its rulers are unworthy, the fall becomes not only possible, it becomes inevitable. The necklace was gone, but the Queen wore its shadow. And shadows can be heavier than jewels. Chapter 20. Diamonds After Death. Long after the people in this story were gone, the necklace remained. Not physically, it had been dismantled and dispersed, but conceptually. In memory. In myth. In the way people still leaned in when they heard the words diamond necklace and Marie Antoinette in the same breath. Some crimes vanish because they are ordinary. This one survived because it was theatrical. It had all the ingredients of legend: royalty, deception, sex, wealth, forgery, punishment, escape. It moved through the world like a novel before novels fully learned how to do that kind of movement. Over time, the story hardened into archetype. Jeanne de la Motte became a template: the impoverished aristocrat, the cunning woman, the survivor who outsmarts men and is punished for it. In some tellings, she is a villain. In others, she is a kind of dark heroine, proof that the system deserved to be tricked. Rohan became the eternal fool, powerful yet naive, undone by vanity and desire. The Queen became what she had always been in public imagination, less a person than an emblem. Innocent or guilty, she represented luxury. And luxury, in a starving country, is always an easy target. Even today, jewelry linked to the scandal stirs fascination. Auction houses can invoke Marie Antoinette's name and watch the price rise, as though history itself adds value to gemstones. Objects become haunted by their stories, and people pay to hold the haunting in their hands. That, in the end, may be the strangest legacy of all. The necklace did not simply expose a fraud. It exposed how power depends on belief, and how quickly belief can be stolen. France did not need diamonds to be angry. But diamonds made the anger glitter. They made it easier to see. And perhaps that is why this story endures, because it reminds us that the most dangerous crimes are not always the ones that take money. They are the ones that take trust. The necklace never touched the Queen's throat, but it tightened anyway. Conclusion. A necklace made of rumor. History is often described as a sequence of causes and effects. Debts, wars, reforms, failures, revolutions, but there are moments when history behaves less like a machine and more like a mind. A mind can be persuaded. A mind can be frightened. A mind can become convinced of something it cannot prove, simply because the story feels true. The affair of the diamond necklace sits at the intersection of those forces. It was, in its mechanics, a fraud, forged letters, staged meetings, a false queen in a dark garden. It was clever, cruel, audacious. It preyed on human weaknesses so predictable they are almost tender: a desire to be forgiven, a desire to be seen, a desire to believe that fate has singled you out for something extraordinary. But the scandal did not endure because the con was brilliant. It endured because the con was perfectly timed. France in the 1780s was already exhausted, not only by debt, but by distrust. Not only by hunger, but by humiliation, the slow, grinding sense that the people who carried the weight of the country would never be the ones who benefited from it. In such a climate, scandal becomes more than entertainment. It becomes an explanation. It becomes a way of making sense of inequality. Look, this is why we suffer. And so an obscene necklace, a thing of impossible luxury, became a symbol large enough to carry a nation's resentment. The real power of the affair was never in the diamonds. It was in what the diamonds allowed people to imagine. To the public, the necklace looked like proof of royal excess. To the monarchy, it looked like a threat to authority. To the press, it looked like a story that could sell 1,000 copies. To political rivals, it looked like a blade that could be slipped between the ribs of a queen. And to Jeanne de la Motte, it looked like a doorway. Jeanne is often painted as a villain, and there is no question she committed a serious crime. She engineered deception, she profited from it, she harmed people who were not innocent, but were not her equals either. Yet what makes her so compelling, and so terrifying, is not simply what she stole. It is what she understood. She understood that Versailles ran on theatre. She understood that power depends on performance. She understood that nobility is not only blood, but belief, and belief can be manufactured. She also understood something about the public, that people do not crave truth as much as they crave a narrative that confirms what they already feel. Rohan's role in the affair often invites mockery. How could a cardinal, educated, privileged, powerful, fall for such an obvious deception? But vanity is not cancelled by intelligence. In fact, intelligence can make vanity more dangerous, because it equips a person to justify what they want to believe. Rohan did not merely want to regain the queen's favour. He wanted to be special to her. He wanted private access to her attention, her trust, her forgiveness. He wanted a redemption story, with himself at the center, illuminated by royal light. Jeanne offered that story, and Rohan stepped into it as though it were a sanctuary. The tragedy is that in a different context, Rohan's longing might have been harmless. At Versailles, longing became political. Every emotional weakness became leverage. Every desire became a tool someone else could use. This was how the con succeeded, not through force, but through cooperation. Not through threats, but through hope. And then there is Marie Antoinette, the woman most harmed by a crime she did not commit. The trial cleared her in the eyes of the law, but law was not the problem. The problem was that her reputation was already living in a separate universe, a universe built by gossip, by xenophobia, by political hatred, by pornographic pamphlets, by the public's need for an emblem of all that felt unjust. She did not need to be guilty. She only needed to be believable. That is the final cruelty of the necklace affair. It demonstrates the gap between legal truth and cultural truth. Courts can issue verdicts. They can punish bodies. They can declare innocence with solemn authority. But they cannot force a country to trust again once trust has begun to rot. By attempting to crush the scandal publicly, the monarchy made the scandal larger. The spectacle of arrest and trial became part of the story, feeding the perception that something was deeply wrong at the center of power. And perhaps something was. Not because Marie Antoinette ordered a necklace, but because the monarchy had come to rely on belief without understanding what belief requires: credibility, restraint, a shared sense of fairness. Once those things fail, power becomes brittle, a glass ornament that shatters under the weight of laughter. In the years that followed, France did not fall because of diamonds. It fell because of legitimacy. And legitimacy, like a jewel, is hard-won and easily lost. Once cracked, it does not sparkle the same way again. The necklace vanished into markets, sold stone by stone, its physical form erased. Yet its ghost remained, carried in stories, revived in books and auctions and whispered retellings. Because in the end, The Affair of the Diamond Necklace is not only a story about fraud. It is a story about a society that could no longer agree on what was real. And once that happens, the fall is no longer a possibility. It is simply a matter of time. The necklace never touched the Queen's throat, but it tightened anyway. Bibliography. Encyclopaedia Britannica Editors. Affair of the Diamond Necklace. Encyclopaedia Britannica. Accessed January 10, 2026. History.com Editors. How a Scandal Over a Diamond Necklace Cost Marie Antoinette Her Head. History.com. World History Encyclopedia. Affair of the Diamond Necklace. World History Encyclopedia. Accessed January 10, 2026. Wikipedia Contributors. Affair of the Diamond Necklace. Wikipedia. Lamotte, Jean de Saint-Remy de Valois. Memoirs of the Countess de Lamotte, various editions/translations. London, late 18th century. Nicole d'Oliva. Testimony and Trial Records. Paris, 1785 to 1786. Parliament of Paris. Trial Records and Judgments Relating to the Affair of the Diamond Necklace. Paris, 1785 to 1786. Campbell, Lady Colin, Gertrude Elizabeth Blood. The Mystery of Marie Antoinette. London, 1901. Fraser, Antonia. Marie Antoinette, The Journey. New York, Anchor Books, 2002. Lever, Evelyn. Marie Antoinette, The Last Queen of France. Translated by Catherine Temerson. New York, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, 2000. Schommer, Simon. Citizens, A Chronicle of the French Revolution. New York, Vintage Books, 1989. Danton, Robert. The Literary Underground of the Old Regime. Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1982. Danton, Robert. The Forbidden Bestsellers of Pre-Revolutionary France. New York, W. W. Norton, 1995. Hunt, Lynn. The Family Romance of the French Revolution. Berkeley, University of California Press, 1992. Price, Monroe. The Fall of the French Monarchy, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette and the Baron de Breteuil. London, Macmillan, 2002. Tackett, Timothy. When the King Took Flight. Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 2003. Furet, François. Revolutionary France 1770 to 1880. Translated by Antonia Neville. Oxford, Blackwell, 1992. Jones, Colin. The Fall of Robespierre, 24 Hours in Revolutionary Paris. Oxford, Oxford University Press, 2014. Baker, Keith Michael. Inventing the French Revolution, Essays on French Political Culture in the 18th Century. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press.